Good evening. Tonight we are going to explore a few mysteries tied to the city plan of Washington, D.C. It is going to show what happens when historical archaeology meets sacred geometry. The 1792 city plan of Washington, D.C. is an artifact. It is also a historical document. It exists. It is not a description or our memory. The city mapped out on the artifact is virtually the exact same thing laid out on the ground. Symmetry appears to be the rule, but sometimes it is the asymmetries that led to an even greater design hidden in the plan. It is an important artifact because it also functioned as the primary reference for building the city during the 19th century. In the end, it was faithfully represented on the ground. This document is also an artifact of pure mind and imagination. It is a snapshot of what a capital city for this nation should look like. The mission of President Washington and his first planning commission was to make a city that was worthy of a nation. But that appears to be all that we know. Exactly why the city looks like it does is not part of the historical record. Sacred geometry was chosen as a tool to examine the plan. Its great advantage as a forensics tool is that this kind of geometry is based on perfection. It makes perfect geometric constructions and houses a huge array of proportional constants. Sacred geometry provides replicable and quantitative data. It is a perfect standard for exploration because it epitomizes a standard based on perfection. Sacred geometry was also a tradition known the world over for thousands of years. It is famous in the West because it is the same geometry you had to know before you could enter Plato's school in classical Greece. It was especially celebrated by the Freemasons and many other intellectual and philosophical societies in late 18th century Europe, including the colonies during the Revolutionary period. The city was contained inside a 10-mile square federal district. If the southern states agreed to help pay for the Revolutionary War, then it was also agreed that the capital would be established midway between the South and the North. New York City and Philadelphia, the cities where the temporary government was already set up, were also in the running. In the end, the District of Columbia was chosen, and the site of the city was selected along the banks of the Potomac. This is a map of the mile markers that were placed around the perimeter of the district. Most were laid out by Andrew Ellicott, President Washington's surveyor. Some of the mile markers are still in place. This is what the city landscape looked like when the 1792 plan was first drawn up, showing the sites for the Capitol and the White House. The Capitol building was to be placed on Jenkins Hill, the highest point on the local landscape. The Capitol would be the center of the design and the central hub of the new national government. George Washington chose the site for the presidential mansion, later called the White House. It is said that he chose the site because it was on higher ground, which would protect the mansion from the threat of river flooding. When the time came to decide what kind of city they would build, opinions ranged widely. Thomas Jefferson preferred a simple grid to reflect a simple, humble federal government. Instead, we inherited a highly complicated, state-of-the-art European Baroque city. This is what the Baroque style looked like, both as cities and gardens. The city roots of Washington, D.C. are found in the European Baroque. Versailles connection. Some have suggested that the DC plan, especially in the central core, was heavily influenced by the ground plan of Versailles in France. Wikipedia discusses the Baroque approach to the French landscape, the Garden à la Française, or Baroque French gardens, in the tradition of André Lenormand. The French classical garden style, or Garden à la Française, climaxed during the reign of Louis IV of France, 1638–1715, and his head gardener of Gardens of Versailles, André Lenormand, 1613–1700. The inspiration for these gardens initially came from the Italian Renaissance garden of the 14th and 15th centuries and ideas of French philosopher René Descartes, 1576–1650. At this time the French opened the garden up to enormous proportions compared to their Italian predecessor. Their gardens epitomize monarch and man dominating and manipulating nature to show his authority, wealth, and power. René Descartes, the founder of analytical geometry, believed that the natural world was objectively measurable and that space is infinitely divisible. His belief that all movement is a straight line, therefore space is a universal grid of mathematical coordinates and everything can be located on its infinitely extendable planes, gave us Cartesian mathematics. Through the classical French gardens, this coordinate system and philosophy is now given a physical and visual representation. This French formal and axial garden style placed the house centrally on an enormous and mainly flat property of land. A large central axis that gets narrower further from the main house forces the viewer's perspective to the horizon line, making the property look even larger. The viewer is to see the property as a cohesive whole but at the same time is unable to see all the components of the garden. One is to be led through a logical progression or story and be surprised by elements that aren't visible until approached. There is an allegorical story referring to the owner through statues and water features which have mythological references. There are small, almost imperceptible grade changes that help conceal the garden's surprises as well as elongate the garden's views. The avenues radiate from the origin point of the city, the capital of the United States. They radiate in all directions. The capital is the omphalos, the navel, the origin point of this nation. Washington, D.C. is unique among Baroque cities and landscapes because of the capital's central role in the plan. Generally, the central pivot of all Baroque creations was the royal palace, representing the monarch. The palace was transformed into a secular presidential mansion, and removed from the center of the plan. In its place, the House of the People was installed, the capital of the United States of America. Unlike kings, the president was a temporary, elected position that ran for 4 years. The House of the People would represent the public, and be filled with elected representatives from the general population. In 1790s, this was a first among world nations. The city was laid out on a grid of north-south streets that were numbered and east-west streets that were lettered. Diagonal avenues named for states provide the city its Baroque style. While there is a geometric, symmetrical, aesthetic side to the Baroque, there was also the national security aspects to some designs. Theoretically, the design would come handy in defending a palace during a popular uprising of the citizens. Since all approaches radiate from the palace, it would be an easy affair to place cannons at the origin of the avenues, providing the government forces an excellent defense against the mobs moving against the king. This was not the idea behind the plan for Washington, D.C., but stylistically, the design demonstrates this military aspect. The city was also laid out exactly as the plan initially determined. George Washington chose the site for the presidential mansion, later called the White House. It is about 1.6 miles away from the Capitol building. It is in the northwest quad of the city. His reasoning, at least publicly, was that it should be on higher ground to protect the property from flooding. For modern Freemasons, this was a strange choice because the president was a Freemason. And, for Freemasons, the northwest is a very dismal direction. For Freemasons, the north represents evil, the west represents death. It remains one of the mysteries of the city. Why did President Washington place the presidential mansion in such a negative quad? This is just one of the mysteries of the plan for Washington, D.C. that we are going to look at. Washington, D.C. was built according to the official plan of 1792. The built city is a near-perfect realization of this design. The few exceptions prove the rule. The strict symmetry of the design is impeccable. The original idea for the Washington Monument was the president on a horse. This is the central core of the 1792 plan. The original vision for the presidential inauguration was different than it is today. Instead of Pennsylvania Avenue, the Central Mall was to be the focus of the inauguration. After being sworn in at the Capitol by the Chief Justice, the President's parade would proceed west along the Grand Avenue of the Mall, walking toward the Washington Monument. Originally that was to be a statue of General Washington on his horse, facing south. Then the parade would turn right to the White House. This was a perfect right angle, which seems to be significant for reasons only known to Freemasonry. The strict symmetry was altered when the huge obelisk was chosen for the monument. This is the 1792 central core from the Ellicott map. The Washington Monument lines up with the White House on the 16th Street axis. This was a key intersection that tied together the east-west axis and the presidential axis. This is the modern central core of Washington, D.C. looking east toward the Capitol. The modern city is a virtually perfect realization of the official plan. However, the offset of the Washington Monument from the 16th Street trajectory, which is the White House axis, is plainly visible. An exact replica of the plan was laid out during the 19th century. One of the only exceptions occurred when they changed the idea for the Washington Monument. The perfect symmetry of the mall was corrupted when the geology at the monument's intersection was found too weak to support the weight of the huge obelisk. A column was placed 1 mile east of the Capitol, which is now Lincoln Park.
From which, all distances, of places through the continent, are to be calculated.
The Capitol Mile was a functioning feature of the city plan. It is also an excellent feature for the cartographic detective. This is the distance that determines all others. The Capitol Mile is a key feature, especially in a city representing the origin, the nexus of creation. On the Ellicott map, the midpoint is celebrated with a circle inside a square, a sacred geometry icon. This half-mile radius turned out to be the key that unlocked the map. President Washington's Freemasonic choice for a White House in the Northwest Quad is a vague, possibly minor mystery of the story. Another mystery of greater overall importance is, who exactly was the author or authors of the plan? Did Andrew Ellicott really create the design? Ellicott's was the only name attributed on this official document. Ellicott was President Washington's surveyor. Until the 1880s, Ellicott was the official author of the plan. It is a fact that the primary, if not only, document the 19th century city planners had to work with is in front of your eyes at this minute. Being faithful to their duty to fulfill the wishes of their first president, the plan was mirrored on the ground, almost flawlessly. What else could they do? All they knew was that Andrew Ellicott was the author of the plan, or at least its main creative source, since none of the commissioners included any of their names on the official document. These would include Thomas Jefferson, a deist, and Alexander Hamilton, a devout Christian. Andrew Ellicott was a Quaker, and there is not a spot of direct historical testimony from any of them, including the president, about what they did and why. Or was it indeed all Ellicott's idea? If so, where the hell did he ever get the training for such an ambitious endeavor? He was known as a surveyor, and nobody else on the commission had any idea how to plan a city, much less a complicated Baroque masterpiece. These were some of the thoughts that rattled the brains of city planners during the 1800s. In the 1880s, the city planners and historians would discover that Ellicott was an imposter. The mystery of why this confusion surrounds the very inception of the plan is compounded by the historical mystery of the absolute paucity of historical documents related to the actual development and creative vision of this plan. From a historical archaeologist's perspective, this was a nightmare. There is so much history that survived the revolution, and yet, there is nothing but a black hole when it comes to what is probably the greatest material artifact bequeathed to the nation by the Founding Fathers, the capital city. It was inspired from scratch on a landscape akin to a glorified swamp. This would be the first time in modern history that a brand new nation would have the opportunity to create its own capital city at the moment of its birth. The city would be created from scratch and built on near virgin ground. What other nation in the last 1,000 years had that opportunity? And what other nation, when born out of revolution, ever devoted its laws to individual citizens in the form of a democratic republic? The historical magnificence of that moment, of that opportunity, to christen your new nation with your very own capital city of your own design, it is fairly overwhelming. And there are no historical documents even discussing this aspect as it pertains to how the city expressed all this. Even worse, we have no direct history of their thoughts, and in their own words, about the creative dimension of this city. The bottom line, there are no surviving commentaries, discussions, or anything written that documents how this complicated plan was arrived at, beyond the Capitol and the placement for the White House. Plus, there is no historical document that clarifies why the name of the true genius behind the plan was stricken from the map. I have this recurring nightmare that all of these records from the early committees might have gone up in smoke when the British invaded and burnt down the Capitol and other buildings in 1812. It is just a bad thought. It is especially a bad thought when trying to deal with the urban anomalies that turned up during the investigation. The biggest mystery involves the Great Seal. On the front of the seal, which is called the obverse side, there is an eagle. Above the eagle's head, inside of a crest, we find a six-pointed star, which we commonly call the Star of David, or Solomon's seal. In geometry, this kind of star is called a hexagram. The star itself is made up of an arrangement of 13 stars. The stars themselves are six-pointed stars. In geometry, this specific symbol is called a double tetrachis. A tetrachis is a single triangle made up of 10 points, and looks exactly like a bowling pin triangle. 3 additional stars transform the triangle into 2 overlapping triangles. The tetrachis is made up of the perfect triangle, also called the equilateral or 60-degree triangle. On the reverse side of the Great Seal, we find the pyramid. The 13 ranges represent the 13 colonies. The scholar of mythologies, Joseph Campbell, calls this the first pyramid. The pyramid triangle is isosceles. The base angles are roughly 70 degrees, and the apex is close to 40 degrees, though not exactly. During the investigation, when each kind of triangle was discovered on either side of the Capitol building, a couple questions naturally arose. Were these symbols from the Great Seal? Were they intentionally embedded into the design of the city? Are these symbols intentional features of the plan, or are they just an incredible accident? What degree of integrity do these geometric features possess when compared to the symbols in the Great Seal? Further, what is the degree of integrity of the geometry itself? That is, mathematically, what is the accuracy of these features? The pyramid component of the symbol has 13 ranges, representing the 13 original colonies. On closer examination, the pyramid in the modern mall can also be said to consist of 13 ranges, in the form of 13 city blocks, from 14th Street to 1st Street. On the 1792 plan, the pyramid feature was composed of the 13 city blocks between 15th Street to 2nd Street. If we look closely at the pyramidion, or the triangle with the eye in it, there seems to be a hint of it at the top of the triangle as the pyramid enters the Capitol grounds. The apex of the eye triangle is the origin of Pennsylvania and Maryland Avenues West. In the 1792 plan, the apex of the eye triangle reaches the western steps of the Capitol. When built, the apex was tied to the Capitol Rotunda. The pyramid eye symbol includes the Western Terrace, the site of the presidential inauguration. These photos were taken of President Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009. President Ronald Reagan was the first president to hold his inauguration on the Western Terrace. The stage of the oath is built directly above the fountain. This is the Western Terrace on a normal day. It does not take a wild imagination to at least question whether this is a representation of the Eye of God, also known as the Eye of Reason. Even though the eye symbol is often associated with the dread of Big Brother watching, the eye also possesses an internal, psychological meaning. For example, the eye represents the third eye of the individual citizen. As a government of, and by and for the people, perhaps it would be fruitful to internalize their meaning. This will be explored further in Part 2. As if this was not strange enough, there is another feature that is very difficult to consign to coincidence. Is there a Masonic square and compass also embedded in the plan? You would need two opposing angles of 60 degrees and 90 degrees. A Masonic square and compass is constructed with a triangle overlying a square. The precise angle for the triangle is 60 degrees. For the square, 90 degrees. The G in the center can stand for God or geometry or both. Was there a Masonic square and compass embedded into the design as well? The compass element extends from Lincoln Park. It is the same angle used by the Star of David symbol, a 60-degree triangle. The square element is the intersection of Louisiana and Washington avenues. While the avenues do not connect, their trajectories do. The G in the center can stand for God or geometry or both. It is in this center that we find the Capitol building. While the pyramid and the star hexagram are completely realized in the streets and avenues, this square and compass symbol is only partially realized. In order to view its grandeur, the trajectories of certain avenues must be extended. This is a more circumstantial argument than for the Great Seal symbols. Nevertheless, it is fairly stunning, at least hypothetically. Our Union Station and the power plant placed to symbolize the fusion of the Freemason concepts underlying the triangle and square. The Union Station and the Capitol power plant are placed at the exact intersection of the square and compass symbol. Was this intentional? Does power generation and travel represent or symbolize a fusion of the Freemason concepts underlying the triangle and square? Or is this just another remarkable fluke? If there really is a square and compass enveloping the Capitol, then there is another mystery inside of this mystery. Louisiana Avenue was not constructed until the 1930s. Does this mean the symbol was not part of the original design, but was added during the FDR administration? Did FDR, a 33-degree Freemason, recognize this feature during the planning for Louisiana Avenue? Did the planners themselves realize what they were completing, or were there hints of this embedded square in the original design? Needless to say, this constellation of geometric features has never been reported before. They are in plain sight and very accurately portray national and religious symbols surrounding the Capitol. They are in plain sight, written into the streets. There is no distortion. They are precise. On the other hand, they are utterly unreported and non-historic. How does historical archaeology deal with these very non-historic anomalies in the plan of our national city? The national symbols from the Great Seal laid out on either side of the Capitol. As we will find later, they are proportionately correct as well. And a Freemason square and compass surrounding Capitol Hill, with the sacred center focused on the Capitol itself. They are completely unprecedented in the Baroque world. In fact, they are outrageously foreign to the Baroque. They are completely unprecedented in city planning, at least during the previous 1,000 years. It is one thing to lay things out, geometric symbols and animal drawings on the ground, like the famous Nazca ground figures in the Peruvian desert. With respect to Western civilization, and especially the Baroque period, there is no historical evidence that even hints that such features were ever used. How do you prove something that has never existed before in the annals of city planning? How can historical archaeology deal with these very non-historic yet quantitative anomalies at the physical heart of our national city? What exactly is historical archaeology, anyway? According to Wikipedia, historical archaeology is a form of archaeology dealing with places, things, and issues from the past or present when written records and oral traditions can inform and contextualize cultural material. These written records can both complement and conflict with the archaeological evidence found at a particular site. Studies tend to focus on literate, historical period societies as opposed to non-literate, prehistoric societies. This story is about what happens when historical archaeology encounters a secret society. The obvious place to begin was the early history of the Great Seal of the United States. The Great Seal was officially created and accepted by Congress in 1782, on the summer solstice. The pyramid symbol had an earlier incarnation in the colonies when it appeared on the Continental script during the Revolution. In 1782, it was later selected as a symbol for the Great Seal during the third and last committee charged with the design. From greatseal.com, we learn the following. The final design of the Great Seal on the 13th of June, 1782, Congress asked Charles Thomson to come up with a suitable design for America's Great Seal. With the reports and drawings of the three committees before him, he set to work. 53 at the time, Thomson had served the past 8 years as Secretary of the Continental Congress, where he acquired a reputation for fairness, truth, and integrity. Well versed in the classics, he was once a Latin master at an academy in Philadelphia. Thomson incorporated symbolic elements from all three committees with ideas of his own to create a bold and elegant design. He made a sketch and wrote a description of his design. For the front of the Great Seal, Thomson made an American bald eagle the centerpiece and placed the shield upon the eagle's breasts. Thomson envisioned an eagle on the wing and rising. In the eagle's right talon is an olive branch. In its left, a tightly drawn bundle of 13 arrows. Thomson said these symbols represent the power of peace and war. In the eagle's beak, he placed a scroll with the first committee's motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. For the crest above the eagle's head, Thomson used the radiant constellation of 13 stars suggested by the second committee. He described the light rays as breaking through a cloud. For the reverse side of the Great Seal, Thomson used Barton's suggestion, an unfinished pyramid with the Eye of Providence in its zenith, but added a triangle around the eye, like the first committee did. He also created 2 new mottos, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages, and a Nunc Coeptis, Providence has favored our undertakings. After consulting with William Barton, the position of the eagle was changed to displayed, wings spread with tips up, and the chevrons on the shield were changed to the vertical stripes we see today. Thomson submitted this design to Congress on the 20th of June, 1782, and the Great Seal was approved that same day. This day was also the summer solstice. From the GreatSeal.com website, it says, the first die was cut 3 months later, and on the 16th of September, 1782, the Great Seal was impressed on a document for the first time. That die was the obverse, eagle side. A die for the reverse, pyramid side has never been created. The pyramid side was never cut into a die. Only the eagle would be pressed onto documents with hot wax. If the pyramid symbol does indeed exist in the Capitol Mall, perhaps one could argue metaphorically that the die was indeed cut and pressed into the landscape. Many Freemason symbols come straight out of the geometry, but most of the geometric shapes they choose for their symbols have great antiquity, going back thousands of years before the secret society was born, and thousands of years before the math inside the shapes was ever discovered. And while it might be true that there were many Freemasons among the founding fathers, many were not. Further, there were also many active non-Masonic societies who were also familiar with the geometry and used it as a source of their symbols. The geometry has remained popular to this day, especially by Madison Avenue campaigns who use the geometry as a source for a vast number of corporate logos. With respect to the city plan, it is extremely important to know at the outset that the first planning commission for the city was made up of men sharing a range of religious beliefs. President Washington, to be sure, was a Freemason, but there was also a deist, a devout Christian, a Quaker, and even a Catholic involved in its creation. This wipes out any notion of a Freemason cabal at the heart of the city plan. The same applies to the design history of the Great Seal itself. It came together by the agreements of many minds of many religious and philosophical persuasions. Faced with a historical archaeology conundrum, sacred geometry was adopted as the means of objective exploration. It is an outstanding detective tool. Perhaps it should be called forensic geometry when investigating art, architecture, monuments and other structures. It is a universal tradition that archaeologists in general are just beginning to appreciate as they delve deeper into the material cultures left by our species' ancestors. It is an extremely accurate geometry, and all of these symbols are easily constructed with a few circles and lines. The geometry is absolutely objective. It is a non-random, self-evident and self-referencing mathematical framework sewn into space. Sacred geometry is a lawful system. The constructs themselves epitomize perfection. In my investigation, sacred geometry was applied to this historical artifact. The official plan for Washington, D.C., dated 1792. Being objective means that others can check your work and replicate the results if need be. The math is built inside the natural constructions. The principles are always the same and the data is quantitative. When exceptions turn up, they are also quantitative. Often, sacred geometry evidence is complex and difficult to follow if you are new to it. Fortunately, the evidence from the Great Seal and Washington, D.C. is based on the simplest of constructions. It is actually sacred geometry's first step. The seal's symbols originate inside 2 circles sharing the same radius. This construct is called the vesica piscis. The vesica piscis is popular in archaic art traditions. In the West, Jesus and the Mother Mary with child are commonly placed inside the vesica. The vesica piscis is the starting point of sacred geometry. This introduction demonstrates the use of both lines and circles to generate more points while filling out the internal structures, such as the perfect triangle and hexagon. Walking the compass around the circle results in the flower of life. These circles continue ad infinitum. Everything starts with the 2 initial points. The vesica piscis and the geometric origins of the Great Seal. The vesica piscis is an easily replicated spatial construction, or device, that initiates a proportional and mathematical framework. The natural intersections provide the points for perfect constructions. The model can be extended as a line of circles. Moving the compass to successive points is called walking the compass. The intersections supply the points. You connect them. This is how sacred geometry works. The hexagram, the hexagon, the cube, and the square root 3 rectangle are shown. Many other shapes and constructions are possible. The family hexagon, the 60-degree triangle, and the hexagon are the first perfect shapes one encounters with compass and straight edge geometry. The two triangles. What are these geometric origins of the two triangles in the Great Seal? Nature's connect the dot geometry is on full display with the star hexagram. Isolating the intersections of the hexagram produces this design. 13 stars make up the star hexagram above the eagle, and represent the original number of the colonies. 13 is a very special number, and only recently became negatively charged. The 12 disciples in Jesus amount to 13, as do the 12 zodiac signs and the sun. The stars making up the pattern in the 1782 Great Seal are also 6-pointed stars. During the 19th century, the 13 stars were changed to pentagrams, which are 5-pointed stars. Manufacturing this symbol demonstrates the connect-the-dot methodology of sacred geometry. Each star represents an intersection point, plus a center point. The pyramid, and the vesica piscis. The pyramid triangle is also located in the vesica piscis. It is an isosceles triangle with base angles of roughly 70 degrees, with an apex of about 40 degrees, plus or minus a degree. The geometric symbols in the Great Seal are very simple to construct with sacred geometry. In fact, they can be derived as soon as the vesica piscis is formed. It could mean, the two triangles are symbolically, and literally, associated directly with creation, and the origins of the manifested world. The string of circles was laid out along the east-west axis, dividing them all. Again, you just walk the compass along using a 1/2 mile radius. This creates a circle that is a mile wide. Since the capital mile was highly symbolic, it seemed like a 1/2 mile radius was worth a try. Lincoln Park, the Capitol, and the Washington Monument were all centers in this string of circles. Not only do we find two of the nation's symbols from the Great Seal, we find them in the exactly correct proportional relation to each other when the east-west axis is laid out in a string of circles based on a 1/2 mile radius. This decreases the coincidence scale a bit more. These figures from the vesica piscis have mathematical consequences, such as their angles and their overall proportions. Both symbols arise from circles with a 1/2 mile radius. Both symbols are completely accommodated by the streets and avenues as they were laid down. The features are not distorted. In fact, they are virtually perfect representations, both as they stand alone, and in their proportional relation to each other. They occur in the city plan in the exact same way as they would if you were to try this out at your desk. This means that these results are replicable, a fundamental requirement of science. The pyramid and hexagram are shown in the context of the model. Here, the map is oriented east. Richard Hoagland, director of the Enterprise mission, cites a 39-degree angle for the apex of the pyramid triangle. If that is exact, the base angle for the pyramid is 70.5 degrees. My reading of the apex angle was roughly 40 degrees, even allowing for that mystical standard close enough for government work. We find a triangle proportionally consistent with the Great Seal's pyramid, in the heart of Washington, D.C., and it includes both the Western Terrace, the site of the presidential inauguration, and it includes the inaugural parade route down Pennsylvania Avenue. This mathematical precision mirrors the geometrical model, tipping the scale of probability even farther away from statistical chance. Was the second pyramid triangle also included in them all? If so, this would provide additional evidence that the string of circles model was utilized to initially lay out the east-west axis. There was a major clue that led to this discovery. This is the mall's double X intersections midway between the Capitol and the White House. This second pyramid is focused on the Washington Monument. It is not completely realized in the built avenues, but the trajectories of the avenues are both focused on the monument. This second pyramid triangle occurs exactly as it would when drawing out the design on paper. The X is derived from an intersection characterized by angles of 40 degrees and 140 degrees. Two triangles involved with the symbology of the Great Seal of the U.S. have been located along the east-west axis of Washington, D.C., on either side of the Capitol. On their own, the triangles were virtually perfect fits accommodated by radiating avenues originating at the Capitol. Beyond anything else one might want to think about these geometric anomalies, they are scientific facts. They exist in a quantitative state, they are objective, and they can be replicated in your own living room. Further, both were shown to be proportionately congruent with the natural intersections of the vesica piscis. Not only are there symbols from the Great Seal gracing our Capitol, they have been captured in their native state, in circles sharing the same radius. Was this the way the east-west axis was laid out in the first place? If so, that would constitute an explanation of why this axis turned out the way it did. If so, then sacred geometry as a tool for archaeological forensics shed some light on what had previously been part of that black hole known as the historical nature of the city's plan. Both symbols, then, accentuate the notion of balance. If one triangle is drawn, then the other one is also represented. The idea of balance applies to other sectors of the city as well. Part 2 examines some additional geometric anomalies in the city, primarily north of the White House. This is the neighborhood of one of the most controversial conspiracy theories about the layout of the national city. Some have called the star north of the White House satanic, probably because that is the way they want to see the star. But in order to see a satanic star, you have to distort it. The popular idea is that the star is distorted because it is an attempt to deceive, which after all, would be normal because that is what the devil does. But this is all presumption. You are second-guessing the designer. If on the other hand, the investigator discovers a star that is proportioned exactly the way it is found north of the White House, then that would be an objective line of questioning to follow. The star north of the White House is a squat star that looks like somebody sat on it. They didn't. It is a naturally occurring star. The hexagon has its own 5-pointed star. So do many polygons. The star north of the White House happens to be an exact fit to a star that occurs in the octagon. Again, sacred geometry, as a forensics tool, allows no presumption of distortion by the planners.